You're watching TelecomTV's exclusive video coverage of the first ever OPNFV Summit held here in San Francisco. It's time now for our panel discussion, and the subject of this discussion is My Customer's Customer. What do enterprises need from NFV? To help me answer it, I'm joined by two guests today, and on my far right we have John Zannos, who is VP Cloud Channels and Alliance with Canonical. And next to John, we have Jake Loveless, who is CEO at Lucera.
Yep.
Thank you both for joining me today. Jake, let's start with you.
Okay.
What is your company's involvement with OPNFV? Because your company targets the financial services sector, doesn't it?
Yeah, and we don't make it out that often to come to conferences. I mean, if you, so basically what Lucera, what we do is we're an infrastructure as a service provider exclusively for Wall Street. So we only do financial services. Our customers are banks and exchanges and people like this. We run a massive software-defined network. Certainly one of the largest software-defined networks in the world. And we've actually been doing network function virtualization at this point for going on 10 years. So we're big Intel partners, and this is obviously a community that we want to get involved in. And as kind of somebody who I think has traveled the trail of tears of deploying these things in production environments, where you have really stringent performance requirements, security requirements, reliability requirements, our war stories and our tales, will just kind of help make this next generation networking better for everybody.
So, Jake, you've got that direct connection there with a large sector of the enterprise market. Yeah. John, what about Canonical? Because we know I know Canonical from Ubuntu. What's your connection involvement with OPNFV?
So we have a broad connection on a couple fronts. First, full disclosure, I'm part of the OPNFV board as well, and we're quite active on helping propagate it. Our view, similar to Jake's, is we think the marketplace is looking for network virtualization, network simplification, and automation across the board. We basically think it's the same for the enterprise, financial services, and telecom in general. Our view is a couple key points. One is we want to simplify and automate it. The other part that we're working very closely with OPNFV about is adding more open source elements to it. When we think of it as there's a platform piece, the physical assets, the software like the cloud platform, OpenStack, a control plane, and then the VNFs themselves. To the extent you can add commoditization through that whole stack, that's going to be better for our customers. It'll simplify things for the marketplace, and it'll take cost out of managing the network.
I mean, you're well versed in open source, the company. Do we need it? Do we really need it for NFV? Because when we looked at the development of NFV, going through Etsy, we weren't necessarily talking open at that stage. So why are we talking open now?
Well, I think there's broad market dynamics that are driving this, right? The carriers, the enterprises, everybody's competing against these new generation companies. Google, Facebook, Airbnb, they're changing industries holistically, and they're doing it through software and automation, and they're changing the broad economics, right? So when you look at the carrier space, for example, the reason they've gotten open source DNA is because they recognize the economics are fundamentally different. There's part of the stack that I think will always be proprietary, but as you go from the hardware up the stack, there's more and more commoditization that's going on. The other important part that we see time and time again is the pooling of innovation. One of the fun things I love about these sort of conferences, the open source conferences, is you have somebody sitting next to each other from AT&T, Orange, and Verizon. Typically not friends on every morning, right? But they're sharing in development, and the reason being they recognize that innovation's happening so quickly that they need to innovate together. Then they'll find areas to differentiate, and that will always be proprietary. But where they can innovate together and then create a solid foundation, in this case for network function virtualization, they all can leverage that. And then they'll compete in the market where they actually are different.
Jake, can I ask, the financial services sector, I'd imagine, has very specific and stringent requirements. Is that an ideal match for open source?
See, you would imagine correctly. So it's interesting. Wall Street adopted open source technologies a long, long time ago. And I would say it probably started with the operating system. So certainly with the rise of Linux and the rise of things like Ubuntu and CentOS and stuff like that, and kind of at the fall of Sun, I would say, at the same time. So it's always been there. It's just taking that even further. And what's interesting about our customer base and our community is you don't think of that community as being a pusher or an innovator in open source. But that's actually not the case. It's just that they're not technology companies forward-facing, so they don't shepherd projects. But ZeroMQ, for example, which is a phenomenal messaging layer, was started at JP Morgan Chase. So there's a lot of these things, technology that comes out, and there's a lot of that concept of co-opetition between customers, and there's value in sharing that stuff. The FIX engine, the Financial Information Exchange Protocol, is open. There's lots of open source FIX engines that you can use to build and run things. I mean, the vast majority of a trading stack is actually open. And then, just like you said, those differentiators, right? Those subtle things that generate alpha, those will remain proprietary, but a lot of this stuff is open.
Please.
To add one point, because I think this is really important. And what the open source framework allows is for that sharing to occur in a safe way, right? The problem in the past has been when there hasn't been this open source framework, people would share and then not know when it would be used against them, right? But what open source allows is for contribution to be shared broadly. So you basically have parts of the stack that become, we're all going to make better, and whatever we contribute, everybody gets to see. And that structurally is what's opening the door.
I'm curious about assumptions, because one of the assumptions I've been working on for some time is that there are differences between customers. If you're a cloud provider, if you're a telecoms carrier, or if you're an enterprise, you've got different needs, and the assumption is, well, maybe NFV's not always suited to every group. Telecoms carriers, quite a small group. Enterprises, large and diverse. Do they have the same needs and requirements? And John, you were saying earlier about there is no difference really between these types of customer and their requirement for NFV.
I think my view is that, are there nuances? Absolutely, right? But at the end of the day, what do you need broadly? Compute, storage, network, right? You want that network to be reliable, of high quality, and easily available. And as long as you have that, regardless of what sort of company you are, what sort of industry you are, and we all know that software is infiltrating every industry, then you get what you need out of the network. The concept of NFV, at the end of the day, is about automation, simplification, right? Quality, and basically commoditization. That's the open source element. That's valuable to everybody. And I think while everybody will have a little skin of difference, right? 80-20 rule, right? 80% is very similar. Personally, I think it's the 99 and 1% rule. I think 99% of what they're trying to do in the network can be commonly used across industries.
So Jake, same from you. You don't see there's a hard fight here?
And I think it might be because we're in the 20, and maybe the customer base is in the 1. But to me, there's just a fundamental units that we have in software. You've got performance, reliability, and security. You make trade-offs, right? And in how you design systems, how you implement systems, between those 3 edges of that triangle, right? I can build you a system that is Fort Knox, lockdown secure. It'll take 40 minutes to boot, right? And and if it crashes, you'll never figure it out. Which is one of the reasons why it's so secure. But so I think, to your point, I think a framework is uniform. I think the concepts are uniform. But I think what's really, really important, and kind of this is what we were talking to people about today, is to say, as you're building these solutions, as you're building this software, don't pigeonhole yourself into one end of that triangle. It's really important to have the flexibility for customers to take, say, a load balancer, right? Classic example. If you're doing a web scale out architecture, you're going to want that load balancer to be very lightweight and have really nice horizontal scalability. And you're not going to really care so much about the reliability, right? Because you're going to have a lot of scalability there at multiple layers. If you're using a load balancer in front of the U.S. equities exchange, it's going to have a little different requirement. But what's interesting is that the fundamental mechanics of that software are the same, right? So as long as you're designing these systems with that in mind and with the idea of, and by the way, I mean, this is a lot of why Linux is so successful, right? You can have Linux run on a phone, and you can have Linux run an exchange, and you can have Linux on a satellite, right? And having those tunables and thinking about those things. And I think that's key. When we go extreme in any one of those directions, we end up building software that never becomes reusable because we've solved one problem for maybe that 1% or that 20% instead of building a framework for the 100%. Right.
So, I would say that's where we're in absolute agreement.
Yeah.
I think if you think of NFV as a framework, right, then you're able to bring it to the marketplace broadly. That balancing of those 3 points of the triangle is where you differentiate. You know, I think it's important, though, that we don't allow for the framework to become a bunch of separate forks, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So we're in agreement.
We are in agreement. No, we're definitely in agreement. And I think I see this with a lot of open source projects, and we certainly participate in a lot. As a company, we don't just consume; we produce a lot of open source work. Focus is so important, and networking. I mean, if you think about it, our entire industry, we store data, we do work on data, and we move data. We're talking about the last whole part of the industry. That is a ginormous part of the industry. If you take we take the Ubuntu code base and we split it between the networking code and the rest of the operating system, I would bet all the money in my pocket that the networking code is probably 30% of that, and probably the hardest 30%. So let's not do it all. Let's start small. There are small victories that we can have today. We don't have to build everything for everybody today.
So the ideal, or the most likely scenario, is that we'll have a balance between open source and some proprietary elements, more like a hybrid approach, heavy on the open source with that element of proprietary technology on top. Is that correct then?
I think maybe. I think you'll have open source bases and probably proprietary enhancements. Or certainly, as you look at new hardware stacks and things like that, driver portability and stuff like that. That's if you're going to run on an x86 platform and you're going to run on a standard networking card, or you're going to run on a Broadcom chipset or something like that, that's a piece of cake. But if my deployment model is on a Tylera, right, which you haven't heard of for a reason, then certainly that's going to be proprietary because I'm going to have to pay somebody to do that work. But those are differentiators.
Yeah.
Those aren't core concepts.
And I think the nuance here is each industry is going to be slightly different in how much they're willing to commoditize, because what they're commoditizing, they're sharing, right? They're opening up. So depending on each industry, that percentage of proprietary will be slightly different, both on where they want to differentiate and maybe where they just want to make sure that they're not being so open amongst each other.
When we look at NFV, are there some network functions that we just can't virtualize? Is there a limit to what NFV can achieve? Not yet.
I mean, it's interesting. So I want you to imagine. I want you to imagine my job, right? So I run a company that services an industry where if I had a millisecond of jitter, that would be it. That's the ballgame. We're all going home, right? I'm going to be doing customer calls all night long and apologizing, but that's it. It's game over. Latency sensitive, mission critical applications that trade globally. And that's 100% done in software. The load balancing is done in software. The routing is done in software. The discovery is done in software. The firewall is done in software. So are there limits? Maybe. I just haven't had a need to hit them yet. And as somebody who's been doing this for so long, and I'm a student of history, I find it so interesting when we have these Renaissance periods. And to me, this is very much a Renaissance period, right? I mean, just down the street, right there at Stanford, modern networking was invented. And we forget that it all started as software, right? It all started as software running on a box that was made there at Stanford for the Stanford University network that would eventually become Sun Microsystems. I mean, this stuff all ran in software. We moved to a hardware-based model I mean, some of it for business reasons, some of it for performance reasons, but man, thank you, Moore's Law. I mean, I think it's really, I think those performance penalties are just not as acute, certainly within the last 5 years.
John, do you think there's an end game for NFV? Do you think is there a target we seek to achieve, or is this going to just be a continuous iteration of improvements and changing the model?
I tend to be more of the continuous iteration mindset, because what we're talking about, you know, as Jake was just saying, is decisions of degree, right? It's not if, it's more about when and how much. So, you know, for me, we were actually having this conversation last night, NFV is about a journey where you iterate towards, right? The more you can virtualize, the more you commoditize, that's good for everybody, and certainly good for the end customer, right? Whoever's consuming that network at the end of the day. The reason you see companies like Google able to push out multiple services every day, every minute, you know, you turn on your computer and you look at it and there's new functionality, you know, at your portal. That's because there's a huge amount of automation and commoditization and simplification. So for me, NFV is driving to that end state, and it'll be one step at a time. And as soon as you figure that's the last door you're going to go through, another one will open up and you'll go through that one. I don't think anybody should be thinking of it as a Friday the 15th in 2017, we're done. You know, that's not going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot like operating system work, right? Like, when are you guys going to be done with Ubuntu? Like when?
Every 6 months.
You've been working on that for a long time. Like, when are you be done? I mean, but that's kind of the point, right? It's such a big part of our industry.
Gentlemen, thank you very much. It's been a fascinating discussion, and appreciate your time. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.